Hey everybody, KC here. So today's Retail Tomorrow at Morning News Beats segment is going to be a conversation between Patrick Spear, who's the co-founder of Retail Tomorrow, and me, with Troy Beeler. And Troy Beeler is the co-founder and general manager of the Future Commerce Initiative. And we wanted to talk to Troy a little bit because he's going to be running the international track during the Retail Tomorrow block of sessions during the National Grocers Association show in Las Vegas at the end of the month. And we're going to talk about some really interesting stuff, like what can you learn from China and Europe in terms of how retailers approach innovation in the digital marketplace? What are the kinds of priorities and investments that retailers need to be making, especially independents who are entrepreneurially minded? Interesting stuff, I think. It's a good preview of what we're going to be talking about in Las Vegas at NGA. I hope you enjoy our conversation with Troy Beeler. So Troy Beeler, Patrick Spear, welcome to Morning News Beat. Troy, before we start talking about the international track at NGA, which is part of the Retail Tomorrow block of sessions on Sunday, tell us a little bit about the Future Commerce Initiative. What's that all about?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Kevin. The Future of Commerce Initiative, we do executive education programs with retail and consumer products executives. And our whole premise is that executives today need to create their own assumptions about the future of their industry and decide what they need to both do now and learn next so that they can navigate this complex evolution of the industry. And we're fortunate enough to get some great questions from some of our clients each year where we conduct joint industry studies when we're not doing these executive education studies. We've had to look at the amount of automation in the retail industry, that is artificial intelligence and machine learning. And most recently, we completed a study on the future of fulfillment and delivery. So it's a great place to be in the industry. We're focused on being future to present, helping executives disconnect from the trends of today and go into the business models of the future. And our premise is, if you work backwards from there, you'll come up with a great do now agenda of things that you need to do in your organization and the type of organization you need, the structure and the types of leaders and roles and skills that you need for the future that this industry is heading into.
One of the things that struck me as interesting as I was kind of perusing your website was that you talk a lot there about, sort of the future of technology, but also the future of work, right? And which is part of understanding what kinds of skills people are going to need going forward. I mean, you started this in 2018, fully 2 years before the pandemic came along and sort of upended everybody's assumptions about, nobody was talking about remote working to the degree they're talking about it now. If I'd said to somebody in 2018 that 3 years we're going to have something called the Great Resignation, they'd wonder what the hell I was talking about. So to what extent have you had to sort of rethink even the assumptions you were making starting out based on how the world has changed in the last couple of years?
Yeah, absolutely. In this business, I have the great benefit of having a partner, Dan O'Connor, who's part of the Managing the Future of Work initiative at Harvard Business School. And our content around the future of work is based on cases that he's written. And one of the things that I learned by partnering with Dan is that you can't write a case about something that hasn't happened. We've had to look at markets and businesses that have experienced the change already and use that to analyze how those executives, either got the call right or wrong, or what other options they might have had. So we've looked at markets that have digitized much faster than the US. One of those markets is the China market. And so, one of the things that we all know the pandemic did was accelerate the amount of digitization, particularly in grocery. And interesting enough, we were able to look at organizations in China, retailers that operate in China, and how they had to rethink the structure of the organization, the skills of the organization, the roles that they had. So, it sort of just came together that we could take advantage of looking at a market ahead of the U.S. In a place that the U.S. is heading because of the pandemic and because of just general competitive forces out there in our industry. and help organizations think about reskilling their current workforce and think about the workforce that they'll need next based on how this industry is realigning for a consumer who's finding their path to the product in a very different way than in the past.
You know, Kevin, it's interesting that you bring that up too, and you think about Troy. You know, a couple of years before the pandemic, and we were together in Boston in 2019 on our Retail Tomorrow immersion, and you and Dan presented some really compelling content. But then along comes COVID, and while certainly longer term, some of those trends will remain, and some of the directions we contemplated will be accurate. But Kevin, to your point, the Great Resignation and the COVID impacts on our industry and on the workforce are real and seemingly going to be lasting. I think, Troy, one of the things I'm most excited about, and I'd like to hear your perspective, we're going to be talking about international and what can be learned from international markets at the NGA show, during the Retail Tomorrow at the NGA show. And I know you, with your clients, see things from a global perspective. Starting with Asia, how do you guys, you touched on this in terms of how Asia has approached things, but where do you see opportunities for U.S. retailers to apply learnings that you're seeing offshore these days?
Yeah, Patrick, it's interesting. I took my first trip to China in a long time in 2018 to start this study on how commerce is being conducted in China. And it's fascinating that you could look at things that are scaling in the US now, things like the proliferation of food delivery, things like the Amazon Fresh stores, a new type of store format, to things like live streaming, which we've seen in beauty and fashion, but now coming to food as well. Right. And those things started in China right around 2018, 2017. And while they won't globalize the same way, I'm not trying to make the argument that the US is China and vice versa or any other market. But what you could see is the impact that things like large scale platforms in China, such as Alibaba and Tencent and JD, you had retailers there that had to effectively compete with them or compete on those types of platforms. And I think we could see the same thing in the US, large scale platform companies like Amazon is trying to be, and the response that is needed from retailers. So we really found that back in 2018, 2017 in China, these types of capabilities were going to be globalizing. And yet there's even new capabilities in China today for new selling models and new distribution models that haven't yet fully come to the US, but we could see signals of them coming to the US and in Latin America. I think what every retailer needs to pay attention to is, unlike new store formats, which we all used to compete against, you used to be able to watch a store format grow and react fairly quickly to either launch your own version of that or decide if you wanted to be in that business. But one, digital models are crossing borders much faster than stores or trends in stores. And the second thing is these digital models are built on the amount of quality data, the amount of depth of data you have. And so in this new generation of retail, Patrick, your reaction can be too late. You can move from one business model to the next too late, where the leaders in the industry have passed you by and have the quality of data that's needed, have the infrastructure. They've realigned their capital to the new consumer path to product, the new way that consumers want to connect with goods. And so I think, it's very timely to start looking outside of our industry for the capabilities that will come, outside of our country, to the capabilities that will come from China to the U.S. and start to, plan what you need to do now and of course, learn next about those models.
Well, outside the industry also makes sense, right?
Yes.
Because this industry has been slow to react. I mean, it's funny you talk about Dan O'Connor. I was looking through some old stuff the other day, and I mean, Dan was talking about this 10, 12 years ago. And even then it was years after it started, it was still then 10 or 15 years after Amazon started. But let's bring it back to the audience that specifically that we're going to be talking to in a few weeks in Las Vegas at NGA, which is that, and these are independents, which is to say, largely with lesser resources, I think it's fair to say, than a lot of the bigger companies out there. And some of them have really ambitious and aggressive wholesalers behind them. But even in those cases, very often those retailers are not coming along as fast. And some of them, some of them have not invested in e-commerce. Some of them have not invested even in digital advertising. I mean, still the number of independents out there who still rely on things like, newspaper circulars and direct mailers is, to me, mind-boggling. And so how do you, if you say to this audience, okay, we need to look at Europe, we need to look to China to see where things are going so you know where to go, how do you get them, frankly, just to buy into that notion of the world and where it's going?
Yeah, Kevin, I think it might be one of the best times to be an entrepreneur, to be, the best time to be someone that can move and pivot quickly. I think what we're all going to realize in that this next generation of commerce is we're all sellers. Brands are sellers, retailers are sellers. There'll be very few, retail organizations, retail companies that will be able to be a platform in and of itself. I think you can look at the moves today from Walmart, whether it's the launch of Go Local Delivery or their media business. I mean, they're clearly building out their own platform. But others will have to be sellers on someone else's platform. And if you're an entrepreneur and you can pivot, you can find that you can be successful in this model. You don't have to build it yourself. You can rent the capability. You can hop on someone else's platform. And being a seller on an Uber Eats or being a seller on Amazon or the next iteration of the Walmart marketplace, we might find that we're in a place where we have unlikely partnerships and we might be selling unlikely places. But I think looking at China, that's exactly what independents have done. One of the things I'll talk about in the session is this idea of community buying groups that have really changed fresh grocery in China. It's a way that independents, mom and pops, have found their niche by aggregating consumers into a buy of things like poultry or eggs or vegetables and become a distribution point for those. But the magic in this, Kevin, is that they've predetermined who's going to accept these goods. You don't have to stock a store and hope that people come in and deal with food that is expiring. You're really shortening the supply chain in these community selling models and doing away with things like returns or damaged goods because it's been sitting in a store. So I think that entrepreneurs, independents, mom and pops can absolutely find a way to be a seller on platforms and in the next generation of commerce. None of this has to do with stores going away. I mean, stores will still be there. It just depends on what kind of digital models you want to put on top of that. And you're right. Very small part of the industry is migrating sort of up this spectrum of selling models. But I think there's more to come, and learning about it today and planning on how you want to participate in that future, I think it's an important step for all retailers.
Patrick, I could tell the words uncommon partnerships was about to come out of your mouth.
You know me too well, Kevin. Yeah, it's fantastic because it does align, Troy, what you're saying aligns with one of the final session that Kevin, the panel discussion that Kevin will lead at the end of our Retail Tomorrow session in Las Vegas, focused on uncommon partnerships. But it's if I hear you correctly, Troy, and tell me if I'm thinking about this correctly, this do now, learn next perspective is really crucial because, Kevin, let's face it, if we talk about stuff that's just too aspirational, too far out there, we're going to get eye rolling and people are going to think that's not my business. I'm never going to do that. But with this do now, learn next, and what I believe I'm hearing, Troy, are digital platforms that retailers can capitalize on that may not be capital intensive, that they can bolt onto or participate in, that allow them to start thinking about an actionable do now
Yes.
that helps them start to migrate across the spectrum. Is that correct? Am I thinking about that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, take, for example, the amount of virtual restaurants or ghost brands that are out there now on the food delivery apps. And
Yeah.
I think, all independents have some, capability to make a sandwich, to cook a meal, to have a prepared offering, some sort of prepared offering in their stores.
Mm-hmm.
And a do now might be, we just need to try and see what we could put out there on a food delivery network that leverages the existing capital that we have in our stores to prepare food, make some sort of prepared food offering, and see what it's like, see what capabilities are needed to be a seller on a platform, or see what it's like to organize consumers in a way that offers them, an unbeatable discount on goods, but change the relationship on how they buy them in a way that you're pre-selling those items into the consumer and allowing them to pick it up at your store or run a very efficient delivery network of those goods. So I think, unlike the past where it took big investment in creating your own technology and customizing your own technology, or owning every part of the value chain, I think now there's many ideas out there on how you can partner, federate, use someone else's platform, use someone else's infrastructure, and really extend what you do well to a way that consumers want to connect with those goods and products.
Let me ask you a question though, and not to be skeptical about everything you're saying, but when you talk about being on other companies' platforms, and I'm not sure how these deals are structured in China, except I would imagine, and tell me I'm wrong if I am, that there's a greater sense of the collectivity in China than there perhaps here is in the United States. Fair?
I think that is fair, Kevin. I think what you also have in the US is technology companies and other networks that need what retailers are good at: a supply chain, infrastructure that aggregates goods. In some cases, it's about combining audiences. So I think there is different motivations here. You've seen some announcements recently about Facebook's aspiration to get closer to commerce. I think, the large digital advertising companies are coming to find out that as good as they are, they don't have conversion. There's not a way to say if that ad actually led to conversion in the store. So you might see closer partnerships down the road between retailers and companies like Facebook, so that a retailer can leverage the large audience size and the multiple touch points that a Facebook has, but then Facebook in turn gets the conversion of goods that you can experience in a retail store, or goods that are delivered to the consumer. So different motivations, but I think there still is motivations here in the U.S. to think about these uncommon partnerships.
Okay, but first of all, if I'm a retailer and Facebook comes to me, and Patrick's laughing because he knows exactly where I'm going to go here. If Facebook comes to me as I'm an independent retailer and says, "Oh yeah, we'd like to get into business with you," that's frankly, that should scare the crap out of me, because Facebook is really great at mining data and using it for its own purposes. But listen, I'm a Facebook skeptic, so I'll start with there. But that in a lot of ways has been my argument. What you're talking about in some ways sounds a lot like Instacart. It sounds a lot like Instacart. And I am, while I think what Instacart is doing is brilliant, I also think that Instacart is its business model is oriented towards its own growth and enriching its own people, not towards building its own brand, not building of the brands of the companies with which it does business, because it takes their data and it can weaponize it against them. And it's totally, and now it's getting promotion money from manufacturers, it's getting ad money from manufacturers, stuff that 10, 15 years ago, if you suggested to a retailer you were going to get in between the retailer and advertiser promotion money, they would shoot you on sight. And now it's like, oh yeah, it's fine because they're going to allow us to get into e-commerce. And it's like, really? I mean, I just wonder if, and again, I'm trying to put I'm actually in this case trying to put my head in the position of where what I think independent retailers ought to be thinking, not necessarily what they are thinking.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot have embraced Instacart because they figure, hey, it's an easy way to get into business. They get me into this in on 30 days. I'm all of a sudden in e-commerce. How great is this? They're playing a short game, not a long game.
Yes.
So I guess
expedient.
I'm sorry?
It's expedient.
Yes. So
Yeah.
I guess my question is how is that, if we're going to say that that's a kind of model that is successful in China, and it ought to be success, or Europe, and we ought to, and that retailers need to figure out a way to be successful using a similar model here, are there certain guardrails they should be putting up that are either like what the ones that are in China and Europe, or don't exist there because the culture is different, but they should be worried about it here? That's a really long question.
It's a good question, though, and one of the ways that we're going to tackle it at the Retail Tomorrow portion of the NGA show is we're going to look at Carrefour's recent announcement with their federation with Meta, Facebook parent company, and not to suggest that the size of Carrefour is anywhere close to it independent, but that CEO came to the conclusion that they couldn't get to where they wanted to go alone, and so they formed this partnership with Meta. So we're gonna.
Carrefour is a big company,
a huge company,
big company.
Yes, and yet they couldn't reach the point where they were reaching the size of the audience and the number of touch points that Meta had. Plus, there was some technologies that they're hoping to gain from that for use for their associates and sort of, technology infrastructure. So one of the ways we're going to examine that question that you gave is looking at the decision that Carrefour arrived to in their markets across Europe and in Latin America with this partnership. But I'm also going to bring up this idea of it doesn't have to be a federation amongst a retailer and a technology company. I think there's a lot of opportunity for the independents to come together to decide, what shared resources that they want to have in areas such as distribution. We've clearly seen what Kroger and Ocado has decided to do with the way that they're sort of re-engineering the fulfillment network that Kroger's going to use. I think independents and regional groceries can come together and make some similar decisions amongst themselves. So it doesn't have to be if the idea of a Google or a Facebook or companies like that seem too risky based on past experiences in this industry with technology companies. I would encourage everyone to think about what this industry can do amongst themselves to come together. I think it's going to take some alignment around their assumptions about the future, like how big digital grocery is going to be in this country. I'll put out, what I think it's going to be, but I think the industry needs to come to their own conclusion about that. And then, as Patrick said, sort of start to work towards those tangible things that they could do today, so that by the time we get to, 20-25% of grocery going in a digital way, that the infrastructure is in place, the fulfillment networks in place that put retailers in a good position to still hold on to those sales.
Hey, Patrick, I don't know if he's going to talk about it specifically in that context, but Neil Stern of Good Food Holdings is going to be speaking as part of the Retail Tomorrow block at NGA. And that's a perfect example of, albeit owned by a company, a South Korean company, but basically pulling together the resources in the intellectual property and the marketing resources of Metropolitan Market in Seattle and New Seasons in Portland and Bristol Farms in Southern California. And sounds like essentially what they're kind of doing. And I would imagine with the right fit, you could see that those alliances and that family or that umbrella growing a little bit.
Yeah, and I think if there's one theme that sort of is foundational to what we're going to be talking about and what we're exploring here, and it's this idea that every assumption needs to be challenged. Everything we've done, we have to assess the relevance moving forward. And I say that as somebody who's been running a trade association, and everybody knows where we landed on that. The market's changing. And I think we're going to see it at retail, and we have to think differently about, what is the do now, Troy, right? How do we inspire those owners, those operators to think differently about the do now? Because what is not an option is doing nothing. And that's where I think we really have an opportunity around challenge the assumptions, think about what you're going to do now, think about where and how you partner and collaborate. What is the uncommon partnership? And then, of course, focus on what you learn next, and just to keep that progression moving. We can't stand still. We can't assume that, the past models will be relevant. We've got to think about what it's going to take to collaborate and keep moving forward.
Troy, let me throw one last thing at you. I was fascinated. One of the things that you talk a little bit about on your website in terms of the Future Commerce Initiative is the notion of investing, right? And it's important for these companies to continue to invest. And I guess the question I want to throw at you real quickly is, when companies hear investment, I think they very often think about investing in systems, right? And technology. How important would you, I'm giving away my answer to the question just by asking the question, how important do you think it is that they also invest in their people?
Yeah, extremely important to invest in your people, because while all retailers, large and small, are going to be focused on automating some part of their business, those things, whether they're manual or cognitive, that happen in the routine, I think everyone's going to go after automating that, which actually will free up some of your organization to work on the things that will really position the organization for success in the future, to work on future scenarios, to work on the areas of innovation. And so reskilling the organization first, I think just preparing the organization for the pace of change and the amount of change that's going to come is really fundamental. We use a case that was written by Professor Bill Kerr at Harvard Business School called Unilever's response to the future of work. And that's the initial premise of it, is just to get everyone comfortable with how much things are going to change and how constant that change is going to be. If we all look back over our careers in retail and we look at some of the big inflection points, I mean, the things sort of took a while to develop. The time when Walmart really started to nationalize, sort of early 80s to where that sort of model, you could argue, sort of peaked out as initial e-commerce came. I mean, that was a pretty long time, 1980 through, 2015, maybe you could argue. And then just look at the pace of change sort of since then. So I think that's, fundamental for everyone, just to prepare their people. And then to help them understand that, certain parts of your role will be interested in automating or augmenting, and that will require new skill sets of leaders, new ways to sort of govern the organization or to govern your part of the business. It's not necessarily about everyone becoming a coder. I mean, we're all going to have to assess things differently, ask new questions, lead in different ways, lead different types of people, and then start to frame out what your role of the future is, whether you're a merchant or in supply chain or store operations. Take a look at the signals of change in this industry and start to prepare yourself and your team for that future. And I think it's absolutely critical, Kevin.
Well, listen, I can't wait. I won't be able to go to all your sessions because I'll be leading my own. But I think I'm really looking forward to seeing what I can see. I encourage everybody who's going to be at NGA to attend the Retail Tomorrow block on Sunday. I guess it's February 27th. I think it's going to be really interesting and really get people to think about the world differently. Troy Beeler, and I've always Patrick Spear. Thanks for doing this, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
See you in a couple of
Thanks,
weeks.
gentlemen. Looking forward to it.
See ya.
Thanks, Kevin.
Bye.